The county fair was alive with energy. Children darted between booths clutching sticky cotton candy, their laughter rising above the lively hum of conversation. Brightly colored tents flapped in the gentle breeze, and the air was thick with the mingling scents of funnel cakes, roasted corn, and sizzling sausages. It was a day of celebration, where locals gathered to showcase their crafts, talents, and traditions. Tucked away near the edge of the fairgrounds, Mary's booth stood out, not because it was flashy, but because of its simplicity. The hand-painted sign read, "Handmade quilts, Amish craftsmanship in neat lettering," and the display table was lined with quilts of exquisite detail. Each stitch was a labor of love, and their vibrant patterns told stories of tradition and dedication. Mary, an 18-year-old Amish girl with soft, freckled cheeks and hair tucked neatly beneath her bonnet, stood quietly behind the table. Her younger brother Eli, just 12, sat beside her, shyly folding smaller quilted items. Mary glanced nervously at the passing crowd. While she was used to curious glances, today felt different. The county fair wasn't her usual environment, so noisy, so modern. But her family had insisted she come. The quilts needed to sell, and this was their best chance. Mary's heart swelled with a mix of pride and apprehension as visitors stopped to admire her work, some purchasing, others offering kind words. Yet the modern world felt heavy and loud, a stark contrast to the quiet life she knew. Her quiet reverie was shattered by the sudden roar of motorcycles. Heads turned as a group of bikers rolled into the fairgrounds, their leather jackets glinting in the sunlight. They parked near the food stalls, drawing uneasy stares from fairgoers. At the head of the group was Jake, a burly man with a shaved head and a jagged scar across his cheek. His booming laugh echoed as he and his companions dismounted and began striding through the fair. Mary tensed as the group approached her booth. Eli looked up, his young face wary. Jake was the first to speak, picking up a neatly folded quilt with one hand and holding it out like a foreign object. "What's this?" he sneered, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby fairgoers. "Something for Grandma's couch." The bikers behind him erupted in laughter. Mary's cheeks burned. She took a small step forward, her hands trembling as she tried to muster the courage to respond. "This is handmade," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the fair's clamor. "Each one takes months to make." Jake raised an eyebrow, feigning interest. "Months, huh? Must be why it's so boring." He tossed the quilt back onto the table carelessly, knocking over a stack of smaller items. Eli jumped to his feet. "Don't touch that," he said, his young voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. Jake turned his attention to Eli, his smile turning cruel. "What's this, little man? You gonna stop me?" Before Mary could react, one of Jake's friends, a wiry man with a snake tattoo winding up his arm, stepped forward and shoved Eli back into his seat. The boy stumbled, his face pale with shock. "Leave us alone," Mary said, her voice stronger now, though her heart was pounding. She clenched her fists at her sides, willing herself to stand firm. Jake leaned in closer, towering over her. "Or what?" he said, his breath reeking of beer and tobacco. The world seemed to shrink around Mary, the noise of the fair fading into a dull roar. She felt trapped, her throat dry as she searched for words that wouldn't come. The biker's laughter was interrupted by a firm, steady voice. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see an older man standing nearby. He was tall and lean, his face weathered from years of working under the sun. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his piercing blue eyes, and he leaned on a sturdy wooden cane that looked as if it had seen its share of work. "Mr. Thompson," someone whispered from the crowd, recognizing the retired farmer who was well respected in the community for his quiet strength and fairness. Jake turned to face him, his grin faltering for a moment. "And who are you, old man?" he asked, though his tone lacked its previous confidence. Mr. Thompson took a step forward, his cane tapping against the ground. "Someone who doesn't like bullies," he said calmly, his voice steady. "You've had your fun. Now move along." Jake hesitated, glancing back at his crew. For a moment, it seemed as though he might challenge the older man, but something in Mr. Thompson's unwavering gaze made him think twice. With a shrug, He stepped back, motioning for his friends to follow. "Fine," Jake said, his tone dripping with mock indifference. But as he turned to leave, he shot Mary a parting glance. "We'll see you around." The bikers sauntered off, their laughter fading as they disappeared into the crowd. Mary let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Eli clung to her side, his small hands gripping her sleeve. "Are you all right?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice softening as he turned to Mary and Eli. Mary nodded, though her hand still trembled. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson gave her a reassuring nod. "You've got nothing to thank me for," he said. "Just don't let people like that scare you. They're all bark and no bite." But as Mary watched the bikers disappear into the throng of fairgoers, Jake's parting words echoed in her mind. Something told her this wasn't over. The fair carried on as if nothing had happened, but for Mary, the joy of the day had been stolen. Her hands trembled as she rearranged the quilts Jake had carelessly tossed aside. Eli sat close to her, his face pale and eyes darting nervously toward the crowd. "Don't worry, Mary," he whispered. "They're gone." But Mary wasn't so sure. Jake's words lingered like a storm cloud. She forced a smile for Eli's sake and resumed selling, though the weight of fear made each interaction feel heavy. As the sun began to set, the fairgrounds emptied. Mary and Eli packed up their booth, the quilts carefully folded and loaded into their horse-drawn buggy. The ride home was quiet, the rhythmic clop of hooves the only sound. When they arrived at their small farm, their father noticed Mary's unease. "What happened at the fair?" he asked, his stern voice laced with concern. Mary hesitated but told him everything. Her father listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each word. When she finished, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Mary. The community will know of this." Word spread quickly among the Amish families and their English neighbors. By morning, a quiet resolve had settled over the community. The Amish didn't believe in violence or retaliation, but they believed in standing together. The following Saturday, Mary's family attended another event at the fairgrounds, a livestock auction. Mary's heart sank as she saw the bikers' motorcycles parked near the entrance. Jake and his crew leaned against a fence, laughing and smoking. As Mary and Eli walked past, Jake called out, "Well, look who it is. Our little quilt maker." This time, Mary didn't flinch. She walked on, her back straight, her faith in her community giving her strength. Jake's laughter faded when he noticed something unusual. A group of Amish men and women had gathered nearby, their quiet presence commanding attention. Among them was Mr. Thompson, leaning on his cane, his gaze locked on Jake. "What's this?" Jake scoffed, gesturing to the crowd. "You all here for a quilting bee?" No one responded. Instead, they simply stood there, their silence louder than any words. The bikers shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their stares. Jake tried to laugh it off, but his bravado wavered. "You think you're tough, huh?" he sneered, stepping closer to Mr. Thompson. "You think you can scare me?" Mr. Thompson didn't flinch. "No one's here to scare you, son," he said evenly. "We're here to remind you of something, respect." Jake opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, another voice rang out. It was the fair organizer, a burly man named Bill, who had heard about the previous week's incident. "Jake, you and your crew are no longer welcome here," he said firmly. "Pack up and leave." The bikers laughed nervously, but when they realized Bill wasn't joking, their expressions darkened. "You can't just kick us out," Jake said, his voice rising. Bill crossed his arms. "I can and I will. And if you don't leave, the sheriff will make sure you do." For a moment, it seemed like Jake might argue, but the growing crowd, Amish and English alike, made it clear he had no allies here. Muttering curses under his breath, he motioned for his crew to follow. They mounted their bikes and roared away, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. The fairgrounds were quiet again, and Mary felt a wave of relief wash over her. Mr. Thompson approached her, his kind eyes crinkling as he smiled. "See, people like that don't have as much power as they think." Mary nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. And thank you to everyone who stood with us." The older man shook his head. "You don't need to thank us, Mary. This is what community is for. To stand together when one of us is threatened." In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal. Mary continued her quilting, her confidence slowly rebuilding. She realized that while the bikers had tried to intimidate her, they had ultimately failed. The strength of her community had shown her the power of unity and kindness. One day, as she worked on a new quilt, Eli burst into the room. "Mary, look," he said, holding up a letter. It was from a local charity, requesting a custom quilt to auction at their next event. The letter mentioned how impressed they had been by her work at the fair. Mary smiled, her heart swelling with pride. The experience with the bikers had been frightening, but it had also shown her the resilience within herself and her community. She knew now that she could face whatever challenges came her way, supported by the people who cared for her. And as she threaded her needle and began stitching the first line of the new quilt, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for her family, her friends, and the strength that came from standing together.